Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you are. It's great to have you here. I am Janice Kamener-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which aside from me is former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Tonight is the second evening of the Jewish festival of Shavuot, the holiday on which the Jewish people celebrate the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai thousands of years ago. In Israel, the holiday is only one day, while in the diaspora, it is celebrated for two. One of the most important Shavuot traditions is to engage in serious study during the course of the holiday. We are so pleased that you have decided to study and learn with us tonight with our special teacher and guest, Franklin Foer. Welcome, Franklin, and thank you for being with us tonight. And welcome and thank you as well to Madeleine Brand, our wonderful moderator. I want to remind you that next week we have two programs. The first is on Monday, June 17th. Monday's program will feature Ambassador Jim Jeffrey of the Wilson Center and Tom Wearick of the Atlantic Council. Both Ambassador Jeffrey and Tom Wearick will discuss a joint proposal of the Atlantic Council and the Wilson Center about the governing of post-war Gaza. To give a bit of background, on May 7th, 7 months after Hamas's attack, a group of former senior U.S. officials with extensive experience in post-conflict stabilization and the Middle East convened to make a plan for post-war Gaza. The effort was led by former Deputy National Security Advisor, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, one of next week's guests, together with our second guest next week, Tom Wearick. The proposal was just released and is being considered at the highest levels. It will surely be very illuminating to hear what was proposed and to hear these experts analyze the future of Gaza. We hope you will join us for the program, which is entitled After the War, A Plausible Proposal for Life in Gaza. You can register in the email you get right after tonight's program. Our moderator for that program will be Warren Olney. The second program next week is on our usual Wednesday. It's on June 19th. It's a program with the very interesting Noah Feldman of Harvard Law School. He just published his 10th book, and this one is called To Be a Jew Today. On June 19th, he will focus on the topic, how October 7th has forced Jews to reckon with Israel. The program will be moderated again by the great Madeleine Brand, who's with us tonight. Now, to introduce our speaker and to begin tonight's program, please welcome Madeleine Brand. Madeleine is the host of the award-winning daily news and culture show Press Play, which airs on NPR's LA affiliate KCRW. Madeleine has hosted and reported for NPR and for affiliate stations for more than 3 decades. She has a master's degree from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, where she also taught documentary radio. Please welcome Madeleine. The program is yours.
Thank you so much, Janice. It's great to be back. And it's great again to interview Franklin Foer. We last spoke here on this program about his latest book, The Last Politician Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. He is the author of several other books, and he is also one of the country's, of course, leading long-form journalists. He's currently national correspondent for The Atlantic, and he's also a New America Foundation Fellow. He was former editor of The New Republic. He's got lots of accolades, well-deserved, and I'm so happy to be able to talk with Frank again. Welcome, welcome.
So great to be here.
Yeah, it's so
Love
great
being interviewed by you.
Well, all right, back at you.
All right.
So we're here to talk about this long, very long piece that you wrote for The Atlantic, and I don't want to dissuade
Not that long.
by the length, but it's but I mean, you can breeze through it in an hour or so, but it is really well written and well researched. And the title is The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending. And so first, before we get to the present, I want you to just describe when the Golden Age took place and its hallmarks. What to you was the Golden Age of American Jewry?
Thank you. So in the months after October 7th, and when I started to think about this moment in the history of American Jewry, I couldn't help but feel something had changed. And for me, it came with a little bit of a sense of loss, that I had grown up in a world where Jewishness was not just accepted, which is very different than the way that it existed in almost every other country in the diaspora, where Jews had to trade their identity away in order to earn the privileges of citizenship. But in America, in the post-war era, after World War II, we had this incredible moment where anti-Semitism drops precipitously. It just falls off a cliff. All these barriers to entry into the American elite disappear. The Protestant monopoly on power just faded, and Jews came rushing into culture, academia, government. And what was so extraordinary about it was the way in which Jewish dreams, Jewish anxieties became American dreams, and American anxieties, that the great Jewish novel became the great American novel, that television was ubiquitous with Jewish characters who spoke in recognizably Jewish ways. And I thought about what life was like for me when I was growing up in the 1990s, where everything from the fact that Dr. Ruth was America's sex expert to the fact that Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song was something that was played on the radio when I went to school. Ivy League colleges were a third Jewish. And that to me was this unprecedented period in the history of the diaspora that I feel like is coming to an end for reasons that have a little bit to do with October 7th, but many reasons to do with other things that have happened in this century.
Right. So you're saying the golden age was post World War II through the end of the 90s.
Well, I don't know when the golden age ended precisely, and it's not, you could argue that it's just something that's kind of faded. It's not that it's ended.
Yeah.
Jews remain an incredibly popular minority group in America. Jews remain incredibly, they're very powerful Jews in government. It's not as if Jewish influence disappeared. It was this era of Jewish ubiquity
Mhm.
that's coming to an end.
And why did anti-Semitism fall off a cliff post World War II? Because pre-World War II, it was pretty rampant.
It was actually rampant during World War II, which is shocking because America was fighting Nazi Germany. Yet in New York City, you had street gangs going and beating up Jews. Father Coughlin, the America First movement, these were all things that existed on the eve of World War II and carried over into that era. And it didn't just, in Ivy League schools, even after World War II, kept lobbying to be able to keep Jews out. That didn't really, those quotas didn't really disappear fully until the early 1960s. But what happened was that obviously the Holocaust tainted anti-Semitism. Nobody wanted to be associated with the crimes of Nazi Germany, given how many Americans fought and died to defeat Nazi Germany. You had the Cold War, which America wanted to project an era of tolerance. And you just had this way in which Christian America became Judeo-Christian America. That was something that became a ubiquitous, I'm using the word ubiquitous, that became a prevalent term in the 1950s.
So, and then you had this flowering of the arts, as you mentioned, especially in literature, obviously, and also music. But when I think of post-war Jewish culture, I think of Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, um,
Yeah,
Saul Bellow.
right. But also include Bob Dylan and Paul
Yeah.
Simon, who were and other members of the
Barbara
folk,
Streisand.
Barbara Streisand. One moment that I excavated for this piece that had always stuck with me was that on the 30th anniversary of the State of Israel, there was this ABC primetime special, The Stars Salute Israel. And the culmination of this you had Sammy Davis Jr., you had every Hollywood star, Barry Manilow, come on stage and fet Israel, and the culmination of the episode was Barbara Streisand appeared on screen, and she was connected to Golda Meir, who had just retired to her house in Jerusalem. And they had this conversation with one another, and it was like the two most famous Jewish women of the century were kibitzing for our nation on prime time, followed by Barbara Streisand singing Hatikva. And it was just, there was no anxiety about it. That was the incredible part of this golden age where, as Jews, we're trained to feel anxious about our place in the Gentile world. But at that moment, it felt as if you could be unabashed and that the
Mhm.
nation would love you for it.
Yeah, I mean, So Unabashed Seinfeld was what, the most popular show? I mean,
Yes.
and the most
Yeah,
Jewish
exactly.
show ever,
It was a show about nothing, but it was really a show about Jews.
right? So okay, and back then, way back in the 90s and before that, the idea of Israel did not raise people's hackles in general. People were pretty okay with it, people meaning non-Jews.
I mean, Israel has always been a polarizing issue. But you got to remember, within American liberalism itself, Israel was considered the underdog, and especially in the aftermath of the Holocaust, liberalism was really drawn to Zionism. It was one of liberalism's primary commitments, and so you see this beginning with Harry S. Truman, but also continuing through the way that you had people like Reinhold Niebuhr, who were just very, very fervent Zionists. But then after the 1967 war, as we witnessed the rise of the New Left and the anti-war protests, the left and parts of the civil rights movement embraced the Palestinians as they were embracing the whole of the third world at that moment, and started to have a different sort of construct for understanding the way that the world worked. And Israel, which then prevailed in that war and came to possess the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Desert, the West Bank, was suddenly seen as an imperialist nation.
And around what time? That was in the 60s?
After the 67, the Six-Day War,
After, okay,
that's when you start to
no
have
question.
schisms on the left, where a lot of Jews feel a sense of sadness and anger and frustration that the erstwhile comrades and all of these movements where they'd joined arms and marched together suddenly were turning against Israel. And there was this reaction within American Jewry against this new anti-Zionism that had started to creep up. And in that moment, and I think this is a very interesting moment for us to consider in the present, American Jews began to turn inward, and uh, they embraced the cause of Soviet Jewry in the aftermath of the 60s. There were spiritual movements within Judaism, the Havurah movement, the Jewish catalog. There was a flourishing of Jewish spirituality where a lot of the values and sentiments of the counterculture were then channeled into the actual ritualistic practice of Judaism in very, very fruitful sorts of ways.
Right. I mean, a similar thing was also happening in the Catholic Church with Vatican II,
Mm.
right? There was kind of a kind of a hippieization of the Catholic Church around that same time. So I guess I'm wondering when this sort of idea of secularism versus religious the religious implications of support for Israel, and when that became a dividing point in the American liberal left.
I'm sorry, can you just, just
Well,
please?
when you've got people actually making pilgrimages, more conservative Jews, American Jews making pilgrimages to Israel, settling in the West Bank, and what that does during this whole period in terms of the liberal intellectual left.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one uh, rich irony of the post 60s moment is that a lot of, some of the settlers who came from places in the United States to the West Bank who had this more messianic vision were also steeped in hippiedom as well. So there's continuities. But I think what you're describing is the ways in which, so you have the schism in the left, but really what's important to remember is that Israel was a very sorry,
Mhm.
a bipartisan issue in America, up until very, very recent memory. And I think it would be hard to find a liberal in Congress who was anti-Israel in any meaningful sense of the term until well into the century. I mean, there are outliers that exist, but it wasn't a consensus position until relatively recently. And I think that one of the things that drives that more than anything else is you have you have this long era of Benjamin Netanyahu's premiership, and one of Netanyahu's theories of American politics has been to embrace polarization, with not just within Israel, but within American Jewry, and to play that to his benefit. I think that under his premiership, we've seen the shattering of that old bipartisan consensus. And also, we have to acknowledge that policies of the Israeli government played a role in contributing to that exacerbation. And not just the policies of the Israeli government. You have Hamas collapsing the Oslo peace process, and you have the Palestinian Authority rejecting multiple offers for a peaceful settlement of the conflict, and the disappearance of that idea of peaceful coexistence, of the two-state solution, ends up even further polarizing Israel here as it polarizes it around the world.
Right. And sticking a little bit with the American left, or a lot, because we'll talk a lot about the American left and what's happening post October 7th. But the very idea of liberalism is something you talk about in your article, about
Yes.
that it was basically created by American Jews, and this idea that sort of a center left vision of the state that is expansive when it comes to civil rights, when it is expansive with ideas that everyone should, rising tide lifts all boats, that capitalism is okay as long as it's mixed with a little bit social welfare policy. And now, though, there is the idea of liberalism, at least in an economic model, has been tarnished. A lot of people aren't buying it. Certainly many young people aren't buying it, and many people on the right-wing populists aren't buying it. And I'm wondering how that is also being looked at and fueling its anti-Semitism.
Right. So liberalism, of course, is one of the great traditions in Western political thought. But in the 20th century, one role that American Jews played in this country is that we were dream casters, that we took things that were sometimes in our own enlightened self-interest, and then envisioned an America that reflected those values, sometimes often Jewish values, but also a Jewish perspective on life. And so the liberalism that emerged in the post-war era, that emphasized tolerance, that emphasized meritocracy, that emphasized civil liberties, was an American Jewish spin on this classical tradition that suited, as I said, enlightened Jewish self-interest. And one of those interests was in creating a stable political system here. So one of the reasons why American Jews were so enthusiastic about the New Deal and the New Deal order wasn't just that in the shtetl we had our own social welfare system that maybe made us more inclined to that sort of tradition, but we also understood the ways in which the mob and revolution are ultimately dangerous for Jews. And so the reason that Jews embraced that particular political vision was the way in which it led to this broad equality and stability that made life comfortable. And so what's happened is not just the decline of that economic vision, which is real and true, that's been that's disappeared from our country, but it's also the disappearance of those other ideals. Like the idea of tolerance has become something that the left in particular doesn't especially like. It's not there's no universalism in the way that we think about, that the left thinks about identity anymore. It's about particularism. It's about where you're coming from. It's about structures of power, and that there are certain hierarchies of suffering that are used to interpret American life, which has a lot of value to it, but it is different than the liberalism that existed in the 20th century. But you have this broad assault where both the left and the right have been picking holes in that old liberal order.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons that's happened is that we've had this rolling series of crises in the 21st century, starting with 9/11, going through the financial crisis, the Iraq War, financial crisis, and onward. And in crisis, we start to retreat from that kind of broad spirit that I'm talking about. But also in crisis, there's a search for scapegoats. And inevitably, because it's baked into the Western mind, Jews become the most convenient scapegoat at hand.
And then give me an example of what happens. Who is
Right.
scapegoated?
So, I mean, here's an example that I didn't pay a lot of attention to at the time, but I think was interesting, is that you take something like COVID, where you have this mysterious thing that descends on society. You have elites make this decision to shut down society in an instant. It's a very confusing thing for people to witness. It's almost inexplicable. And so you have a surge of anti-Semitism that happens with COVID online and in various parts of the world. Or you have something like the migration crisis that exists in the world. We live in this unprecedented moment where borders really are just much more fluid than they were. You have people moving en masse from different places in the world. There's this quest to, it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. And there's this quest to find the villainous figure at the heart of it. And you have the right stoking this image of, and not just the United States, but also in Europe as well, that there is this puppet master, this Jewish financier who's pulling the strings, who's re-engineering society to serve his people's nefarious purposes. And of course, I'm referring to George Soros. And so George Soros, who's not an especially popular figure among a lot of American Jewry because of his positions on Israel, is maybe an emblematic figure and somebody who was the proverbial canary in the coal mine.
Mm, right. As well as Anthony Fauci is not Jewish, also a big villain. But
yeah, and sometimes I think to myself, thank God Anthony
no, I
Fauci
was thinking that
wasn't Jewish,
too.
because
But I was wondering if some people who don't know probably, who are anti-Semitic probably assume he is.
it's the Brooklyn accent.
So you spent a lot of time reporting here in California in Berkeley on the UC campus and at the high school and in the city of Berkeley, and reporting on what's happening in terms of anti-Semitism on the left. And of course, we've heard and have seen a lot of anti-Semitism on the right with Charlottesville, et cetera. And so what did you see in Berkeley that surprised you, that shocked you?
Right. So, of course, when I went to Berkeley, I think my initial instinct would have been to go to the University of California at Berkeley, because we hear all the stuff that's happening on college campuses. But I kept seeing things happening in the Bay Area at the end of last year that just made me want to make calls to people out there. So there was a menorah on Lake Merritt in Oakland that was thrown into the water and was defaced and replaced with anti-Semitic graffiti. There were these city council meetings that were happening all across the Bay Area, where there was viral video of people coming in demanding ceasefire resolutions. And there's obviously there's a case to be made for a ceasefire, but what was striking was the way in which they described October 7th as a Zionist fabrication. And when I was listening to the way they were talking about Zionist and Zionism, it felt as pretty clear to me that they were using it as a synonym for Jew, and all of these ancient tropes about Jewish power were being applied to the word Zionist and were suddenly entering into the mainstream. So I started calling people in the Bay Area and asking questions. And what I heard was that there was an epidemic of bullying that was happening in Bay Area schools, but also that teachers were in some ways abusing their bully pulpits in the classroom to teach a very, very one-sided view of the conflict. There was a teach-in that happened in Oakland where students were taken out of class to learn why they should be joining in the streets to protest Israeli, essentially the existence of Israel. And they were romanticizing Palestinian resistance. They were romanticizing the protest movements. And what I was hearing, and when I went to the Bay Area, I was seeing with my own eyes, was the way in which if teachers teach a view of the conflict that describes the Jews as villains. The Jews are people who came and stole indigenous lands. You teach that, that's a crude version of the conflict, but then if you teach that to 12-year-olds, they're going to not just think about the Jews over there in Israel who are doing that. They're going to have a view of Jewish villainy that will extend to their own classmates. And that's indeed what was happening. And I went and I talked to kids in high schools. I talked to 40 kids in one Bay Area high school, and I listened to them. And the thing that was striking was, at first, they didn't want to talk about anti-Semitism. They didn't want to necessarily acknowledge the problem. But once they started to talk, they all had these experiences of very casual anti-Semitism that they'd experienced themselves, or that they had witnessed or overheard in the hallways, that they had had this deeply uncomfortable moment when their classmates walked out of class in protest of the war in Israel, and they were stuck in their classrooms feeling as if they were the ones who were being accused. And then if you were a kippah, you were being harassed in you had a visible sign. You were being harassed constantly by your classmates. And it was extremely painful for me to hear stories from the mouths of observant Jews in these schools.
And what were the teachers' responses to that, to this idea that what they were doing, teaching this way, was anti-Semitic?
Well, they would say that anti-Semitism as a charge was being weaponized against them. I saw in various school districts that the teachers' unions were claiming that they had academic freedom to teach whatever they wanted, and that if people were going to complain about what they were teaching in their classrooms, then it was an issue of labor power, and they had a principled need to resist any attempt to curtail what they were teaching. But I also heard that from students, that they felt as if they couldn't turn to teachers and administrators for help when they were being experiencing anti-Semitism, because they felt as if those teachers and administrators weren't sympathetic.
Mhm. And so we've seen similar instances playing out on college campuses, including your alma mater, Columbia, and my alma mater. And so, Columbia has a long history of protest during the Vietnam War, et cetera. And so how do you view what's going on on college campuses, especially Columbia?
Columbia is maybe a sui generis example of protest. I mean, it wasn't surprising to me that that would be the place that would have the most extreme reaction, because, as you say, there is this long tradition there, but it's also the fact that it's in New York City, and that protests at Columbia become a magnet for activists across New York City. There are a lot of people who I would consider to be professional revolutionaries who are looking for a moment like the one that was developing on campus in order to exploit it for their own ends. But when I think more broadly about what's happening on college campuses, I see a couple things. First is the way in which anti-Semitism, which existed before October 7th on college campuses, was largely ignored by administrators because it fell so far outside of the frameworks that they used to deal with discrimination on campus. And this is actually a very important problem, because everybody talks about this binary between oppressors and oppressed, which runs through so much of not just the contemporary left, but then becomes enshrined in bureaucracy through the DEI offices. And there's an analysis of power that's embedded in that, oppressor oppressed. But what anti-Semitism is an accusation of privilege. It breaks that framework. It's this accusation that Jews hold too much sway over institutions. And so there was this blindness that was occurring. The second thing that was happening was the way in which Israel was being stigmatized after the collapse of the peace process, where there was the rise of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which looked to turn Israel into a pariah. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is that you could imagine a movement that was protesting settlements in the West Bank that was based on a strategy of that type of boycott. But it was academic institutions that were being boycotted. It was theater groups that were being boycotted. It was symphonies that were being boycotted. And the fact that by some accident of birth, you were born in Israel, it doesn't matter what your politics were, you were suddenly being treated like a pariah. And again, it's in most people's very unsophisticated minds. It's not when you're boycotting Israelis, it's not a big step to boycotting Jews. And so I started seeing, even before October 7th, the way in which Hillels, which, yes, they have some connection to Israel, but it's not a very central part of Hillel. It's a place where Jews gather to celebrate Shabbat and holidays and to experience a sense of collective identity. It's that Hillels were being described roundly as arms of the Israeli war machine. And to me, that was the problem that was starting to happen and started to see creeping up. And then more, also just in the grander sense, I think that universities cease to become places where we are able to have discussions across political differences. And you take something, and this is just a problem with America, is that we struggle to be able to debate something in a civil sort of way without it escalating to very, very hyperbolic terms straight away, without there being this whiff of violence that ends up creeping into rhetoric. And that's what we're seeing on campuses. Everything is escalating to this level of extremity that is both overheated and scary.
Yeah. And when you say scary, tell me more about that. Are you saying scary in a physical sense? Like, are you afraid for Jewish students' physical safety, or any Jew in America's physical safety?
I think that's a great question, and something we all need, because when something is scary, it's a very subjective description of experience. It means it can be something uncomfortable is scary. And I think we need to check ourselves in a lot of this, where um, just because there is a climate of fear, and because Jews read the Haggadah, we read about how every generation a new pharaoh rises up to oppress us. We know the cycles of Jewish history where we experience golden ages that end up collapsing. All that infuses the way that we process the present. And fear is both a useful thing to have, because the Jewish case for vigilance is sound. There's anti-Semitism that is proliferating. This is the idea that there's not a threat is a form of gaslighting to describe it that sort of way. We have numbers that back up the fact that their vandalism, physical harassment, violence, these things are skyrocketing and are real. At the same time, I think it's important for us to check ourselves to say, okay, fear is helpful, but we can't allow fear to subsume us. If fear becomes the totality of our analysis, we're not going to make the best strategic choices about our place in American life. So I think it's important to balance those two things.
So I guess, there's the question is, can you criticize the war, Israel's, what it's doing in this war, and also, not be anti-Semitic? You can do that easily. And I guess my question is to you, because you've thought about this a lot, why hasn't that been something that the protesters have easily done? I mean, many have, but in many instances they have not, and it has crept into anti-Semitism, and it has become, as you say, scary. So what is it about this particular war that has done that has enabled people and empowered people to give in to these maybe latent anti-Semitic feelings?
So uh there are a couple things. The first is that one thing that happens in protest movements is that you tend to have a romanticization of the resistance movement, and whether it's the Viet Cong, or the Sandinistas, I mean, these are things that are not unfamiliar. It's just terrifying though to see people romanticize Hamas, because Hamas is an organization that in its charter, its original charter called for the genocide of Jews, that in its charter, it cites the protocols of elders of Zion as evidence. And of course, it's been engaged in terrorism long before October 7th, and it collapsed. It played its part in collapsing the peace process through the Second Intifada. And it's just disgusting to see Hamas romanticized in the way that it has been romanticized in these protests, in the ways in which Hamas slogans end up getting mainstreamed in the course of these protests. Why has this happened beyond the generic reason that the left tends to romanticize these movements? I think that Israel over time has been delegitimized, and that provides this. It's ended up become, in the course of its delegitimization, it's become a villain that ends up replicating all of the classical narratives about Jews that are anti-Semitic, that they are bloodthirsty, that they are a villainous force in the world that needs to be resisted and overcome, that it's that a Jewish cabal controls universities or media, and they're pulling the strings, and therefore it needs to be resisted. It's a perfect storm where you have the delegitimization of Israel, the collapse of liberal values within the United States, and Israel's own behavior exacerbating everything so that it explodes in the way that we've seen.
Yeah. And then when you look at the culture, when you look at, I don't know, television, Hollywood, movies, music, comedy, do you see any of that replicated, those ideas?
Yeah, so I'm thinking comedy is always a bit of a hard example to hold up, because comedy is a slippery
Mm.
genre where the line between satire and bigotry is a thin one. But you look at somebody like Dave Chappelle and the way that he's pretty consistently had these monologues about Jewish power, and I say, okay, well, that's a pretty profound example. Or I look at the way in which Elon Musk, who is probably one of the most important gatekeepers in the world, has essentially ushered anti-Semitism into the mainstream by restoring anti-Semites to his platform and then tweeting anti-Semitic things himself on a fairly regular basis. Or you have somebody like the podcaster Joe Rogan, who talked about Jews and money. And part of what's happened is that during that post-war era, during that golden age, anti-Semitism was something that was locked up in a chest. It may not have disappeared from American life, but it was something that was verboten. And then you have these ways in which people just open up the chest, and anti-Semitism starts to drift out. And I think you earlier talked about the way that the left and right have kind of co-conspired. And I think that's true when it comes to discourse, that you have ways in which these people on the right have, including the ex-president of the United States, who dined with America's primary Holocaust denier, who said that they're very fine people on both sides, they end up they end up guiding anti-Semitism away from the taboo into the acceptable. And something that becomes culturally acceptable is something that both the left and the right exploit for their own very different purposes.
This wasn't in your article because um, your article came out in March, but I'm wondering if you have thought.
Because it wasn't long enough.
Maybe there'll be a part two. Um,
Yeah.
if what your thoughts are on the Supreme Court and what's been, these the Alito controversy, and what people are now seeing the court as having some members who are willing to talk about their views of Christianity and to make it clear that they are using these views in their opinions and their stance. So Alito was quoted as saying that this is the quote: "People in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that to return our country to a place of godliness." Of course, he was taped at a private gathering, and we can talk about the journalistic ethics of that. But anyway, his wife obviously has similar feelings. She wants to fly another flag, a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag, and I'm wondering if you've thought about how this idea of maybe creeping Christian nationalism, how that is feeding into your thesis that this is the end of the golden
Yeah,
age.
yeah. And it's not just the Supreme Court, it's also it's Trump, it's MAGA, it's Trumpism, which is also helped provide cover for Christian nationalism. I think Trump winks at Christian nationalism quite a bit when he discusses things. You have members of Congress who I think could be described as Christian nationalist, and so this idea that which turns away from the idea of Judeo-Christian America, which is a problematic concept unto itself, but had been something that was the Reagan-esque version, the old National Review version of what America looked like, where you have this new vision, which is based on Christian hegemony. That's definitely a much more dangerous phenomenon that is with everything else. It's marching its way towards the mainstream, in this instance, the mainstream of the Republican Party, and it's scary. It's just a graphic example of the ways in which the old consensus has crumbled.
Mhm. And so what do you think that means for Jews in America?
Um, all right. Well, we can step back, because it's hard to disaggregate this where we talk about one thing or the other. Right? When we talk about what the future of American Jewry, we can't just isolate Christian nationalism or isolate the campus left. That it's all happening simultaneously, and that's the thing that I think feels so unnerving about the present moment. That before October 7th, I began working on this piece in my head about a year and a half ago, where I had a conversation with my brother, who's more religiously observant than I am. And he lives in Boston. And I was saying, anti-Semitism, I know it's important, but it feels like this thing out there. It hasn't really affected my life as an American Jew. And he said, well, it's affected mine. He began to tell me these anecdotes about how, wearing a kippah with his family, walking down the streets of Boston, he was followed by someone who started muttering Trump, Trump, Trump in a very ominous sort of way. And he felt like he had to go into a restaurant. Uh, he told me about his in-laws' little stiebel in Westchester County that had been shot up and by BB guns and had been vandalized and defaced. He talked about how in Boston there was something called the Mapping Project, where an anonymous group on the internet drew this topography of Jewish Boston, all the nursery schools, NGOs, synagogues, and described them all as being part of the Zionist war machine. And that felt very ominous. And I thought, okay, I need to take this more seriously. But as a journalist, even as I wanted to take it more seriously and treat it urgently, it felt still distant to me. And then October 7th happened, and this thing that was suddenly distant felt extremely intimate in my face. It wasn't just that my alma mater, Columbia, had these protests. It was also that my own rabbi, walking down Connecticut Avenue, 500 feet from my house, somebody rolled down their window and started chanting the most virulent anti-Semitic things at her, despite the fact that she wasn't wearing anything that marked her as Jewish. At the base of my street on Connecticut Avenue, just 100 feet from my house, somebody had sprayed graffiti equating the IDF to the KKK. And in my daughter's school, there was a swastika that appeared in a bathroom, all these things that I couldn't dismiss any longer as being distant because they were so in my face. And what does this mean for American Jews? It doesn't mean that we're on the train to Auschwitz. There's a lot of room between a golden age that we experienced before and the worst case scenarios. I think what's more likely to happen is that we'll live in this period that will be, punctuated by more regular incidents of anti-Semitism, of insecurity. And it's not great for our psyche, I'll tell you that much, just given who we are as a people and the way that we process this type of information. I was at the American Jewish Committee this last week on a panel where they'd done survey research, and it was something like 9% of American Jews have, admit that they have seriously considered leaving the United States. I don't know how serious that actually is, but the fact that that conversation is happening, and in my family, it feels like 100% of the Jews are talking about what a plan B
Well, where
might
do they
look.
go? I mean, it
Exactly.
doesn't seem
I
like
mean,
Israel is
it's,
the place to
yeah,
go these days.
yeah, yeah, right. And there's no good option. We should, in my opinion, in my opinion, we should not abandon our ideas about American exceptionalism. That one of the great Jewish contributions to American life was that we helped to imagine a country that could be something closer to its best self. And what we need to do now, in my humble opinion, is return to that sort of tradition to try to articulate a vision of American life that's not just good for the Jews, but that's also good for America.
That is a great ender, but we're not going to end on that. The producer in me is like, that's a wrap. But because we've got a lot of questions that I should let's see, that I should get to. Wow, a lot. Okay. Let's see. All right. I am actually not seeing the questions, unfortunately. Sorry about that. Um, let's see. See,
Yeah, I'm seeing questions.
we are in the chat. Okay, here we are. All right, here we go. I went to the Q&A. All right. Do you think that at some point American protesters will realize that they are making a huge moral mistake by not distinguishing between Hamas on the one hand and rights of Palestinians on the other? Now it seems that all of the protesters are basically supporting Hamas.
I mean, I think so. What's unfortunate to me is the way in which I don't know if every protester. I don't think every protester is self-consciously supporting Hamas. I think that there are very few protesters who self-consciously celebrate Hamas. I think what's disturbing is that anti-Zionism has just spread into the mainstream of these protests, that there's this binary that now everybody has to pass. Are you Zionist? Are you anti-Zionist? And that's the unfortunate thing. And that's maybe not supporting Hamas, but it's supporting Hamas's goals. I spend time traveling through the Middle East. I talk to people in intelligence agencies. And one of the things that I hear all the time is that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, is sitting in his tunnels, and he is a connoisseur of US media. He understands, he's well aware of what's happening on college campuses. He sees that over the course of the long run, he is prevailing because his goal is the delegitimization of the state of Israel. And we saw this yesterday in the leaked messages that the Wall Street Journal obtained, that Hamas is willing to tolerate civilian casualties to achieve its long-term goal. So we want the war to end, but when he sees this evidence that the war is turning the entire world against Israel, his response is, bring it on. Let's keep this thing going because it's helping me win in the long run.
Mm. Well, how do you view Netanyahu's motivations? I mean,
Uh, I actually think that so the president of the United States has said that he thinks that Netanyahu is motivated by his own political survival. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support that without a doubt, that Netanyahu is somebody who is a tactical thinker whose goal is to survive until tomorrow. And he's done a fairly terrible job of thinking about anything beyond tomorrow. And so there is no Israeli strategy for winning the war. And that's scary. So I don't think we can draw any sort of equivalence between Sinwar and Netanyahu, but I think we have to say that there is a terrible dynamic that's happening where nobody who's in power especially wants the war to end. There's one other thing that I think needs to be said, which is that I think for a lot of American Jews, we wish that Netanyahu was this malignancy that could be carved out of Israel, that someday the people will rise up and throw him out of office, and Israel will return to some semblance of equilibrium that we all recognize. But I think that's not totally the case. For starters, I think his popularity has rebounded fairly substantially after October 7th because of the way that the Iran attack was fended off, because the rescue of hostages, etc. But also, the entirety of the state of Israel has been reeling after October 7th. And that one of the things that October 7th did was it disturbed the sense of security that Israel had in the most profound sort of way. It shattered myths about the Israeli state. It shattered myths about the IDF. And once those myths disappeared, and once Israelis entered into the state of trauma, the state of fear, it's prevented them themselves from thinking strategically about their own future.
and there's a worldwide movement to embrace anti-liberal, strong men leaders and strong women leaders. But as we saw in the European Parliament elections.
Right.
Okay, Arnold asked, do you see a connection between the reduction in synagogue affiliation and the decline of the golden age for Jews?
So, if we were to look at, if we were to describe certain positives that have followed the last couple months, one thing that you see in response to October 7th, in response to everything that's happening in American life, is that actually there's an increased sense of identification and connection with Judaism that's happening right now in this country. And you have what I think has been described as the October 8th Jew, somebody whose identity was roused and shaped by the calamities of that day. And that's a very real thing. And it'll be interesting to see and important to see over the long run how organized American Judaism manages to capture that energy and transform it into something sustainable.
Bruce says, can you talk about the very strange paradox of the Christian right, strong support for Israel, and the growing animus toward Jews, and the resurgence of these old anti-Semitic tropes?
I mean, there is an expression that, this is not a universal description of the American right, but that a Philo-Semite is an anti-Semite who loves Jews. And that oftentimes when you look at the people who embrace Israel on the right, they're not doing it out of any great love for American Jewry. They're doing it for their own theological purposes, or because it corresponds to some other worldview that they have where, Muslims are the bad guys and the Jews are fighting with the Christians in this global war. So, I mean, it is a paradox, but it's a very deeply uncomfortable one in many instances.
Yeah, and a related question, does the alliance between Israel and fundamentalist Christians help or hurt the position of Jews in America? It's interesting.
Yeah. So I am going to be an old school liberal Zionist on this question, which is that over the long run, if Israel does not find a way to resolve, for lack of a better word, the Palestinian question, then Israel is doomed. And for a very long time, because of the, in part because of the American right, in part because it just seemed fruitless, America ceased playing a leadership role in helping to um, promote a peace process. And even now, I would say, we have evidence in actually the George W. Bush administration. One thing George W. Bush did profoundly right was that he insisted on the reform of the Palestinian Authority and the creation of Palestinian leadership that was technocratically sound, that was committed to a vision of peaceful coexistence. And you had this brief golden moment. I don't want to speak totally in golden ages and non-golden ages, but you had a moment where Salam Fayyad was the prime minister of Palestine, and you had economic growth, you had unprecedented security cooperation, and that moment dissipated. But there is a moment for that to return now. It would be possible to bring back Fayyad as a leader. That there are other Palestinian leaders who are very competent, of have really high quality, and to integrate them into a future vision for what Gaza could become after Hamas. And most of the Arab world shares that vision, and the United States shares that vision, but we've been unable to actually take the steps that would allow it for it to be realized.
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned George W. Bush. I'm wondering, when you think of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and um, whether or not that also has contributed to this rising tide of anti-Semitism, because the United States linked with Israel and this devastation that the United States wrought on the people of Iraq and elsewhere. Do you see that as tied into this as well?
Yes, I mean, I think one of in the narrative that I'm describing, an important plot point was when John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt published the Israel Lobby, which essentially blamed the Iraq War on Jewish neoconservatives who had dual loyalties, and accused them of being the warmongers who ushered in these sorts of disasters. And you had this way in which the term neocon, which was a code name for Jews, became part of the parlance of the left, and I think exacerbated in ways both small and large this tendency that I'm describing.
Hmm. Okay, final question. Do you think anti-Zionism and or anti-Semitism will play a significant role in the presidential election? I guess, given the fact that Biden is a strong Israel supporter.
Yeah, people worry about college kids ditching the Democratic Party because of Gaza, and all the polling evidence seems to suggest that Gaza falls near the bottom of their most pressing issues. People's kids' disappointment with Biden has more to do with uh, student debt, state of the economy, et cetera, et cetera. But we know the way that this election is going to get decided. It's going to get decided on the margins. And so there are marginal ways in which it's going to hurt him. And I think in a bigger sort of way, the problem that Biden has is that he looks like he's presiding over a world that, despite everything that he's done, is spinning out of control. And people look at Biden and say, oh, this old guy can't put a cork in it. And this war that's dragging on and on and on seems to be another data point to support that.
Yeah. Okay, can you end on a note of optimism? David Lair.
Yeah, I mean, look, American Jewry is resilient. American Jews are resilient. I spent time talking to kids at Columbia, at Hillel there, kids who had experienced anti-Semitism in very, very direct sorts of ways, which we could all agree would be described as anti-Semitism, not just anti-Israel. And when I would talk to them, I noticed that they didn't actually approach this discussion with fear, that they had a very capacious vision of what American Jewry could become, and that their instinct wasn't to push away all their peers who had vociferous criticisms of Israel. They were willing to enter into debates with them. And when they looked at the way in which other Jews on campus were walking away from their Jewish identity, their response was to double down on it, to to continue to proudly wear their kippot, to proudly wear their stars of David. And I have to say, I found that incredibly inspiring. That the kids right there on the front lines are the ones who can see it most clearly.
Okay, good. Thank you for ending on that
Yeah.
note. And thank you for being here. It was a pleasure, as always, to speak with you.
Thank you.
The hour just flew by, just like your article flies by.
Thank you.
Urge everyone to go read the article at the Atlantic website. And join us on Monday with we'll have Ambassador James Jeffrey from the Wilson Center and Tom Warwick of the Atlantic Council. They will present their joint proposal for a post-war Gaza. So join us on Monday, same time, same place. Thank you for having me again, Janice and Mel and everyone. And I look forward to being back with you soon.